Hello again, everybody. So for this video, what I'm going to be looking at is the 1920s. And specifically, I'm going to start this by looking at it through the lens of a person who perhaps more than anybody else captures the kind of spirit of the period, as well as its many inherent contradictions. Henry Ford, the man who put America on wheels. Now, there's a reason why I think Ford is in many ways a perfect kind of symbol, if you will, of 1920s America. And that's because there's a lot of aspects about the 1920s that are very interesting, but also deeply contradictory. The 1920s is, by most measurements, the first truly modern decade in American history, by which what I and others who would say that term mean is that 1920s are the first decade where we have a lot of the things that we kind of think of as, just day-to-day features of life in America today. It's the first decade where a majority of Americans, first off, it's the first decade where a majority of Americans live in and around cities. So that process of the United States transformation from a rural agrarian society to an industrial urban one is basically complete by the time of the 1920 census. By 1920, the United States is an urban industrial melting pot society. Um, but beyond that, in addition to the 1920 marking the first year where you have a clear urban majority in the United States, and where a clear majority of Americans are not engaged in agriculture as their principal source of livelihood. It's also the first decade where we have large numbers of people buying and owning cars. Automobile ownership picks up dramatically. It had started in the decades before, during the 19 teens in particular, but during the 1920s, automobile ownership becomes really quite ubiquitous. And as it does, it really brings about massive transformations on the entirety of American society. New industries come into being that did not exist before, including fast food chains, roadside motels, the idea of kind of the Sunday drive or what have you. The automobile will ultimately change the way people date. It'll change, how and where they live. And it will begin the process of suburbanization in the United States that will pick up with a much greater degree of velocity in the post-World War II period. So there's that aspect of it. But it's also the decade that sees the birth of the modern consumer culture that even now is the defining feature of the American economy. The idea that the economy runs by people buying stuff, by buying things specifically that are seen as ways of showcasing social mobility or, where you are, they're status items, basically. In this time period, of course, that's things like refrigerators, toaster ovens, and radios are the principal big kind of consumer goods. Of course, also cars. And so there's this new consumer culture that comes into existence in the 1920s that had not really existed before, and which really changes many aspects of the American character. And there's also the emergence in the 1920s of mass media, which hadn't really existed before. The 1920s sees the rapid proliferation of radio as a means of communication and receiving news. At the start of the decade, there's one radio station near Pittsburgh. By the end of the decade, there are more than 600. So it's a decade that sees the development of, or the normalization, I should say, of the automobile as a principal means of communication. It sees the emergence of a new consumer culture. It sees the emergence of new mass media. It's also the decade that solidifies that urban majority. So in all of those aspects, the 1920s mark a clear break, a clear point of departure with the period that was before it, and it would has features that would make life in that period at least somewhat similar to and recognizable to those of us alive today. Um, but at the same time, um, in spite of the fact that the 1920s are really a decade busting at the seams with modernity, with new inventions, new forms of mass communication, new forms of transportation, not just limited to the automobile, but also seeing the development of the first commercial airlines by the end of the decade. Um, it's also a decade characterized by a deeply reactionary approach to government, and one that sees the ascendancy of deeply regressive social views in the United States that come about as direct reaction to all of those things of modern life that I mentioned just a minute ago. So it's a period of contrast between this sort of incredible exuberance and energy that characterizes the decade and which has routinely been captured in popular culture, gives it the nickname the Roaring Twenties, and is captured in books and adaptations of books like F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. But at the same time, there's this certain seediness that underlies all of these things, which is, of course, if you've read Gatsby, is a major theme of the book, um, and which drives the United States politically in directions that not only end up, kind of removing many of the safeguards that have been put in place in the American economy during the Progressive era, but also leads the country in decidedly uglier political directions regarding feelings about immigrants, about newfound freedoms for women, and about a new centrality in American life and culture for African Americans that leads the country down some pretty dark paths during this time period. And again, I think that Henry Ford really encapsulates all of these things in one person. He is simultaneously one of the leading figures in bringing about the modernization of American society and bringing the United States into that new modern 20th century. And yet at the same time, politically, he becomes involved with and becomes a leading figure in movements that are in stark opposition to ideas about economic opportunity and the basic promise of the Statue of Liberty. He's a deeply anti-immigrant person, and in particular deeply anti-Semitic, which will come across in a lot of the things I'll discuss. So this is a period, again, filled with contradictions. Now, let's start with Ford's the way that Ford changes American society during this time period in the terms of the automobile. Now, this is one of those things where people tend to think this, but it's not. Thinking something doesn't make it true. Henry Ford, just to start off with, did not invent the automobile. He did not. The automobile was in fact invented about 20 odd years before Henry Ford began manufacturing the vehicle that would put America on wheels, the Model T, in Germany. In the 1880s, the Daimler brothers in Germany actually invented the first internal combustion engine and the first automobile along with it, which one of them named after one of their daughters, whose name was Mercedes, which is where Mercedes-Benz comes from. So Ford didn't invent the automobile. He also did not invent the assembly line or mass production. What he did, however, is he combined all three of those elements together and in the process completely transformed American society. Prior to Henry Ford, automobiles were basically a plaything for the rich. Many people consider them to be not particularly practical. And the reason is because of how expensive they were. Early automobiles were built by professional coach makers, people who had previously manufactured carriages for horse-drawn carriages. And these were things that were built one at a time, were very, very custom, and as a result, very expensive. And so automobiles, in the first 2 decades that they existed, were basically regarded as nothing more than a fancy plaything for the rich. But what Henry Ford did is he essentially democratized the automobile and made it something that could be not only a conveyance, but ultimately a tool for the masses that could be used in a variety of different things. And the way that he did this is he combines different um, separate but distinct things together in creating this. Um, when he launches the Ford Motor Company, his first cars were, like most of his fellow automakers, mass produced, or I'm sorry, custom built. But around 1908, 1909 or so, Ford comes up with something called the Model T. And the thing about the Model T about it that made it so successful and which ultimately completely transforms American society is that it could be built in large numbers and sold very cheaply, both new and on the secondary market. The Model T, uh, from the time it was introduced in 1909 to the time production was discontinued in 1927, by which point more than 10 million had been produced, was its very bare bones simplicity. There were something like 43 steps involved in the construction of a Model T, which may sound like a lot, but compared to other custom made vehicles, it really isn't. Um, Moreover, Ford took the idea of the moving assembly line, which was actually something that had originated in the meatpacking industry, and he applied this to the manufacture of automobiles and mass production. Model Ts were mechanically very simple. They didn't have really brakes to speak of, at least not very good brakes. Early ones had to be manually started with a crank that, if you didn't move your hand away in time, would actually snap your arm in half. Um, and as the saying went, you can get a Model T in any color you want to, so long as it's black. The reason for this being that black paint was both inexpensive and it dried quickly. And so virtually all Model Ts made after 1909 were painted black, at least initially. Um, but in spite of that simplicity, in spite of the fact that it was slow, in spite of the fact that its ride was bumpy, in spite of the fact that, you know, it definitely wasn't the most sophisticated thing on the roads, um, it did have a couple of things going for it. The first was that it was an incredibly adaptable thing. Model T chassis could be made to manufacture everything from roadsters and kind of primitive sports cars to family sedans to pickup trucks. During World War One, the U.S. government purchased large numbers of Model Ts from Ford, which they used as field ambulances on the Western Front. So it could be made into pretty much any configuration that you, as a buyer, wanted. Moreover, they were very cheap because they were made in large numbers, and because, of their simplicity. And so both of those things essentially democratized the automobile in the United States, and created this, kind of love of love affair with the car that has become a feature of American society ever since. And it didn't take very long for Ford's Detroit competitors, GM and Chrysler, to pick up on this and begin manufacturing simple, inexpensive vehicles of their own. And as a result of this, by the 1920s, the automobile had become a major feature of American life. Um, People began using them for every conceivable thing one can that they're still used for today, for commuting to and from work, which led many people to move into new suburban developments that were built with the anticipation that people would drive into the city to work. It changed dating habits, with people being able to pick up their dates and, in some cases, conceive children in the backs of cars, and what have you. And it led to the construction of the first true interstate, interconnected highway system in the United States, designed specifically for automobiles, Route 66, which began in 1919 and which was completed by the end of the decade. Um, Moreover, it creates all kinds of new ancillary industries, roadside motels, um, service stations for people to buy gas and to have service performed on their vehicles when they inevitably break down. Um, the emergence of new fast food restaurants like A&W, which was the first fast food chain in the United States. All of these things come about as a result of this. Um, and in the process, it completely transforms American life, and how people go about their day-to-day business. Um, and it ends up becoming a massive part of the economy. By the end of the 1920s, nearly 1 in every 4 American workers is employed directly or indirectly in the automobile industry, either in jobs directly related to the manufacture of automobiles, or to services related to them. And incidentally, that's the reason why automobile manufacturers chose to locate in Detroit. Detroit was not only very close to a significant international border with Canada, um, which incidentally would also play a pretty big role in why Detroit grows a lot as a result of Prohibition, um, which we'll get into later. But it also is nearby the Great Lakes and that massive interconnected rail system that the U.S. had built in the last part of the 19th century, and is very close to many of the raw materials it needs that are needed to build automobiles: steel, oil, etc. So that's why the big three automobile manufacturers are located in the upper Midwest, in Michigan specifically. Um, so he, in many ways, creates this new consumer culture, this new idea of businessmen as national heroes, and he, in many ways, creates, this increasing urbanization of American society. Yet, on a personal level, in spite of the clearly very important role that Ford plays in creating this new, more interconnected, urban, industrial society, Ford is politically a deeply reactionary figure, and becomes associated quite strongly with the anti-immigrant sentiment that becomes one of the major focal points of American politics during the 1920s. The 1920s politically are a period that's deeply reactionary, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, with many people turning away from the government interventions and regulations of the progressive era, and adopting a governing philosophy that's basically a return to Gilded Age, laissez-faire, pro-business governance. But beyond that, the mass cultural changes that come about during the 1920s, which the spread of the automobile encourages, um, the movement of large numbers of African Americans into American cities, where they become a major feature of American social and cultural life during that decade, a found sense of freedom for many American women that comes as a result of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, and an emerging consumer culture. All of these things, and the centrality of immigrants in building this new urban American society, all are things that deeply irritate Ford. Ford is in particular deeply anti-Semitic, even though most of his workers are either African Americans or recent immigrants from either Southern or Eastern Europe, many of them Catholic and Jewish. Ford is deeply against both. And during the 1920s, he becomes a leading figure in a movement to curb immigration to the United States. That movement directly brings about the reemergence, and resurgence as a force in national politics of the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan which during the 19th century, during the Reconstruction period, of course, have been a paramilitary, basically terrorist group that terrorized African Americans in the South during Reconstruction, reemerges in the 1920s as a major social and political organization. And at one point, it attracts over 4 million members nationwide. And its principal focus and its principal strengths aren't where you would think during this time period. The Ku Klux Klan's biggest strongholds politically and in terms of membership aren't in states in the deep south like Alabama or Mississippi or Louisiana, like you'd probably think. The states that, in fact, during the 1920s had the biggest Klan memberships were Illinois, Indiana, Oregon, and California. Now, 3 of those 4 states are not what people typically think of when they think of the Ku Klux Klan, and or generally speaking, with what it represents. Really none of them are. Even Indiana, which is relatively conservative today, is definitely not thought of in those terms. Um, so, that tells you something. And what that tells you is that the principal focus of the Klan during this period isn't so much in curtailing the freedoms of African Americans, though that, of course, does remain a focus, albeit perhaps a secondary focus of the organization during this time period. The principal reason why the Ku Klux Klan sees this sort of massive national revival and this massive popular support is because during the 1920s, aided by reactionary figures who use their wealth to, kind of push this anti-immigrant rhetoric and anti-immigrant message, like Henry Ford, um, the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s emerges as a principal advocate for restrictions of immigration to the United States from Southern and Eastern Europe. They portray themselves as a organization dedicated to the preservation of traditional family values. And their principal targets are Catholics and Jews, immigrants of all stripes, but particularly Catholic and Jewish immigrants to the United States during this time period. And like I said, the Klan becomes a major focal point of American political life. In many states, like Indiana and Illinois and California, it's very difficult for politicians, whether they're Republican or Democrat, to win an election without a Klan endorsement. And the Klan actually produces its own ballots of approved candidates and ones who are not. And these can and do oftentimes sway elections in the 1920s. The Klan, like I said, during this period, sees substantial growth because of its anti-immigrant rhetoric. It doesn't hurt that there was a movie produced in 1915, Birth of a Nation, which I've already discussed, which portrays the Klan as this sort of, heroic movement during Reconstruction, which of course was anything but. And so the Klan becomes this national organization under the leadership of Grand Imperial Wizard Hiram Evans, and their principal focus is opposing immigration. And they have some success in this arena. In 1924, because of the efforts of anti-immigrant reactionaries like Ford and organizations like the Klan and others that broadcast this anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish message, Congress passes the Johnson-Reed Act, which substantially reduces immigration to the United States. It effectively slams shut the golden door of the Statue of Liberty. And the way that it does this ultimately would sow the seeds for future tragedy. The Johnson-Reed Act, basically, what it did, and this was a law that was passed with massive support from the Klan and other anti-immigrant organizations. What it did is it basically creates a quota system for immigrants coming to the United States. Now, much like the grandfather clauses that were used to disenfranchise African American voters, this retroactively applies a specific date to determining what those quotas are, and that year is 1890, which of course is the year when immigration patterns to the United States begin to shift from Northern and Western Europe and more from Southern and Eastern Europe. And so by putting these quotas in place, it severely limits and in some cases nearly eliminates entirely immigration from places like Italy and Poland and Hungary and other parts of Eastern and Southern Europe. Um, what that's going to mean 15 years down the line is that when large numbers of Eastern European Jews are trying to flee the Nazis in the late 1930s, early 1940s, before the United States joins the Second World War, many of those Jewish refugees will be turned back because of these restrictive quotas that are put in place in the 1920s, and which effectively bring an end to that 80-year-long period of mass immigration into the United States that had started in the 1840s. And so this kind of, again, I feel like reflects one of the darker impulses of both Ford and the American psyche during this time period. It's worth mentioning that Henry Ford um, himself published anti-Semitic articles and, you know, news, as he would call it, during this time period. He had his own newspaper in Dearborn, Michigan, that he called the Dearborn Independent, where he, of course, had complete editorial control and could, you know, spew forth his anti-Semitic venom as much as he wanted to. Eventually, those anti-Semitic ramblings were bound together, packaged and sold in Europe under the title of the International Jew in the mid-1920s. And one of the people who was a very avid reader of Ford's anti-Semitic writings, which portrayed some vast Jewish international conspiracy to control the financial and economic the financial and economic activities of the world, was a disaffected Bavarian corporal by the name of Adolf Hitler. So yeah. Furthermore, it wouldn't be until 1941, a full 2 years after World War II began, with the invasion of Poland in 1939, that the Ford Motor Company formally severed its ties with Nazi Germany. So there's that too. But anyway, so I feel like Ford in many ways captures this dichotomy. Now, there are reasons why this was the case. There's reasons why this all occurred. And a lot of it had to do with the changing nature of the American economy. Basically, during the 1920s, the rural America enters into an economic depression brought about by the sudden end of the First World War and the collapse of the agricultural market that in many ways predates the Great Depression for the rest of the country by a full 10 years. There's a dramatic spike in foreclosures in rural America on farms. During the 1920s, something like 40% of American farmers lose their farms during this period. And naturally, of course, and understandably, of course, that produces a lot of anger. Many rural Americans during the 1920s feel increasingly left behind and quite literally left in the dark as the United States becomes this modern, urban, sophisticated society. And when I say literal, left in the dark, I mean that quite literally. In the 1920s, over 90% of Americans living outside of cities lacked access to basic modern conveniences like electricity and internal plumbing, because basically private corporations had determined that these things were too expensive and wouldn't turn a substantial enough profit to warrant putting them in rural areas. So there's that too. So basically, Ford, is just, part of this general trend in this period. And this increasing tension between rural and urban America in the 1920s. Another example of this comes in 1925 and illustrates yet another feature of the modernization of American society. The radio. Radio rapidly proliferates in the United States during the 1920s. It becomes one of the chief status symbols of the new consumer culture, having a new radio in the living room. And in 1925, the town of Dayton, Tennessee becomes the site of a mass media frenzy when a local teacher is brought up on charges for teaching the theory of evolution in a Tennessee classroom, which is a direct violation of state law at the time period. The teacher in question, a man named John Scopes, had actually been encouraged to do so by local leaders as a means of drawing attention to their struggling town. And basically, the Scopes monkey trial, as it comes to be known, becomes the first trial of the century. It's the first trial to be broadcast on the radio. And basically what happens during the trial is that the outcome is a foregone conclusion, basically. Everybody, the man who was at the center of it, John Scopes, he didn't hide his guilt. And the fact that he was going to be found guilty of doing what he did was pretty much never in doubt. What becomes the center of focus during the trial is the two people who represent the prosecutor and the defense attorney. The prosecutor in the Scopes monkey trial, as it comes to be known, is three-time Democratic presidential nominee William Jennings Bryan, who is a deeply devout religious believer, and who prosecutes Scopes, whereas the man defending him, Clarence Darrow, was at the time a very well-known defense attorney and as well as a very well-known agnostic. So really the Scopes monkey trial becomes this big mass media frenzy about these two personalities. But it also becomes an opportunity for many in urban America to basically point a finger and laugh at their rural counterparts, which is illustrated by the coverage of newspaper reporter H.L. Mencken at the time period, which is oftentimes very elitist and very condescending in nature in terms of how he portrays Bryan and those in rural America by extension. So that's not to excuse the anti-immigrant sentiment of the time period, but it does reflect one of the central cultural divisions of the time, this division between urban and rural America. That is even more further illustrated just a few years later when the Democrats nominate Al Smith as their nominee for president. In the election of 1928, Al Smith, who was the first major party candidate in any American political party to be a practicing Roman Catholic, anti-Catholic rhetoric is really at the heart of the campaign against him by Republicans who nominate Herbert Hoover. In the election of 1928, cultural issues, Smith's support for repealing prohibition, as well as his Catholic heritage, and employing anti-Catholic stereotypes about urban Catholic voters, are really the focal point of that election. It has very little to do with economic issues because both Smith and Hoover at that point both subscribed to the same economic philosophy. So it's not about that. It's about cultural issues. And so this illustrates one of the central features of the 1920s is this cultural competition. Now, in the next video, I'm going to talk a little bit about other areas of culture. But I just kind of wanted to use this time to talk about how all this played out in the 1920s and how this anti-immigrant sentiment really kind of captured this urban-rural divide. One last thing about the Ku Klux Klan, though, before I go, just to make everybody feel a little better about everything. The Klan's heyday in America, which as shocking as it is, or at least still should be for people today, it doesn't last for very long. The Klan eventually having largely achieved its principal aim of major restrictions on immigration to the United States, kind of loses its principal focus. But moreover, um, the inherent ugliness behind what the organization represents begins coming to light. There's a number of high-profile incidents, including one involving the Imperial Wizard of the Indiana chapter of the Klan, who drugged and raped a young woman, who then subsequently committed suicide. That becomes big scandals. And as a result, from 1925 onward, because of these various scandals, the Klan gradually loses membership, and gradually recedes back, and kind of retreats back under the dark crevices of American life, where it belongs, but not before. It and the reactionary politics that it represents ends up having a massive effect on American society in terms of bringing an end to this period of mass migration in the 1920s.